Okay, so you know that feeling, right, when you really want to understand something important. I mean, really get past just the headlines. But then you realize there's just this mountain of information out there. Like, where do you even begin?
Yeah, it can be overwhelming for sure.
Right. So that's kind of what we're doing here with the deep dive. We sort through all those articles and the research papers and, yeah, even our own messy notes to try and pull out the most important insights.
Exactly. It's like we're doing the heavy lifting for you, so you can be, really well informed without having to climb that whole mountain of information yourself.
Exactly. And today we are diving deep into a place that is changing incredibly fast. The Arctic.
It really is. I mean, there are just so many massive shifts happening up there, environmental, cultural, even geopolitical.
Yeah,
It's fascinating and a little bit unnerving, to be honest.
absolutely.
Hmm.
So for this deep dive, we've got this really amazing collection of sources, everything from declassified Cold War aerial photos.
Oh.
I know, right? To the latest satellite imagery from NASA and the European Space Agency. And we've also got firsthand accounts from people living in Inuit communities and some really cutting-edge scientific research.
So we're going to try to connect all of that to give you a clearer picture of what's happening in the Arctic and why it matters to everyone.
Exactly. So one of the things that really surprised me when we were first looking at this material was this unexpected connection between the Cold War and our understanding of the Arctic.
How so?
Well, apparently during the Cold War, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were setting up these high-altitude flights over the Arctic with these huge cameras,
Huge. How?
like 10 by 10-inch negatives.
Seriously?
You can't even imagine.
Wow, that's some serious photography. What were they trying to capture?
Well, it turns out they were taking all these detailed photos of the Arctic landscape for military planning purposes.
Really? So like mapping out potential targets or something?
Not exactly. It's even more interesting than that. They were actually really interested in the precise topography of the Arctic.
Okay, that's a little unexpected. Why would they need that level of detail?
Think about it. At the time, the shortest route for an intercontinental ballistic missile to travel between the U.S. and the Soviet Union would have been over the Arctic.
Ah, so they needed to understand the terrain because even the slightest variations in gravity caused by mountains or valleys could affect a missile's trajectory.
Exactly. So those photos weren't just random snapshots.
Yeah.
They were incredibly detailed. They were even using this technique called stereophotography so they could get a three-dimensional view of the landscape.
So they could almost like step into those images and really get a feel for the terrain.
Exactly. And when you compare those Cold War era photos with the satellite data we have today, the difference in the amount of ice cover is just shocking.
Really? I mean, we all know the Arctic ice is melting, but to see that kind of change over time,
It's one thing to hear about it in the news, but when you actually see it visual.
it really hits home.
There was this expedition to Ellesmere Island in 2023, and they discovered that this ice cap that was clearly visible in those old Cold War photos had retreated so much that it had exposed almost half a mile of bedrock that hadn't been seen in centuries.
Wow. So the Arctic landscape is literally changing before our eyes.
And this is where things get, I don't know, a little bit unsettling. Because that melting ice is actually making it easier for people to go fossil hunting in the Arctic.
How interesting. So it's like an unintended consequence.
Right, like this destructive process is revealing a window into the past.
Right. And while that's fascinating from a scientific perspective, it's also important to remember that the people who live in the Arctic are experiencing these changes in a very real and immediate way.
Absolutely. Their lives are intertwined with the environment in ways that most of us can't even imagine.
Exactly. The Inuit people have been living in the Arctic for over 4,000 years, so they have this incredible depth of traditional knowledge about the land and the ice and the animals.
Right. Their whole culture is built around these natural cycles that have been happening for millennia.
And now those cycles are changing.
Exactly. And that's having a huge impact on their way of life.
I read that the government of Nunavut asked their residents to share their observations of the changing climate, and some of their stories are really powerful.
Yeah, one man from Resolute Bay, Isaac Kalloch, said that the winters just aren't as cold as they used to be.
Makes sense. I mean, we're seeing record-breaking temperatures up there.
Another person from Iqaluit, Jackapusi Pete, talked about how spring is arriving much earlier now.
How much earlier?
He said they've had to move their traditional Tunic Time Spring Festival forward by 2 whole weeks.
Wow. That's a significant shift. So climate change is literally forcing them to change their cultural traditions.
Exactly. And it's not just about festivals either. Simeon Yamagolik from Pond Inlet said that it's getting more and more dangerous to travel on the ice.
Because it's thinner now.
Right. He used to go egg hunting in the spring, which is a really important source of food for them. But now the ice is so unpredictable that it's too risky to even try.
So climate change is directly impacting their ability to feed their families and maintain their traditional practices.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, you have this whole other story that's emerging in the Arctic, the rise of luxury tourism.
Really? Like cruise ships going up there?
More like luxury icebreakers.
That's crazy.
There was this article about this French icebreaker, Le Commandant Charcot, that took a group of tourists to the North Pole.
To the North Pole. Wow. How much did that cost?
Like $90,000 per person.
$90,000. What did they do up there?
Well, they took selfies, of course.
Of course.
And they built snow igloos. And then they went back to the ship and enjoyed Michelin-starred meals and hung out in the spa.
So they're experiencing the Arctic in a way that's completely detached from the realities of the people who actually live there.
Right. It's this very strange juxtaposition. You have people paying a fortune to see the Arctic before it disappears. And then you have the Inuit communities who are struggling to adapt to those very changes.
It's a stark reminder of the inequalities that exist in the world.
Absolutely. But before we get too carried away with this narrative of the Arctic as this rapidly disappearing wonderland, it's important to remember that the Arctic has experienced natural climate fluctuations in the past.
Right. It's not like the climate has always been stable up there.
Exactly. I mean, we read about these explorers in the 1800s like Elisha Kent Kane and Isaac Israel Hayes, who had very different experiences in the same area of the Arctic just a few years apart.
So what happened?
Well, Kane encountered this surprisingly large area of open water in northern Greenland, which made him think that maybe there was an open polar sea.
Ah, the legendary open polar sea.
But then just a few years later, Hayes went to the same area and found it completely blocked by ice.
So it was just natural variation in the climate.
Exactly. And scientists have analyzed ice cores from the Arctic and found evidence of these really dramatic climate shifts that happened thousands of years ago.
So the big question is, are the changes we're seeing now just part of that natural cycle, or are they something different?
And it turns out that even measuring the temperature of the Arctic is a really complicated thing.
Don't they just have weather stations up there?
Yeah, but it's not as simple as just taking a single reading. You have to consider the land, the air, the ocean currents, all these different factors that influence temperature.
And the Arctic is a huge area, so the temperature can vary a lot from place to place.
Exactly. And even the definition of Arctic can be kind of fuzzy.
How do you mean?
Well, do you define it by the area where the sun doesn't set in the summer? Or by the presence of permafrost? Or by certain types of plants and animals?
Right. So depending on how you define the Arctic, you might get very different temperature readings.
Exactly. And all of that makes it really hard to compare data from different sources and draw clear conclusions about long-term trends.
But despite all those challenges, a team of researchers in Finland did a really impressive study where they accounted for all those variations, and they came to a pretty stark conclusion.
What's that?
They found that since 1979, the Arctic has been warming 4 times faster than the global average.
4 times faster. That's insane.
And it's even worse in some parts of the Barents Sea, where the warming rate is 7 times faster than the rest of the planet.
7 times. So it's not just that the Arctic is warming, it's like it's amplifying the warming that's happening everywhere else.
Exactly. And that brings us to the concept of Arctic amplification, which is this really dangerous feedback loop.
How does that work?
Well, you know how ice is really reflective?
Like a mirror almost.
Right. So when sunlight hits the ice, a lot of that energy is reflected back into space.
But when the ice melts and you have open water,
that water absorbs a lot more of the sunlight and heats up.
Which melts more ice.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's this self-perpetuating cycle. And it's not just about the ice either. Changes in air and ocean currents can also trap heat in the Arctic.
And it's not just a small amount of ice that we're talking about either.
No, NASA estimates that we're losing something like 30,000 square miles of sea ice every year.
30,000 square miles. That's like the size of Austria disappearing every year.
It's mind-boggling. And when you look at the long-term data, this rate of change is totally unprecedented in the last 1,500 years at least.
So it's pretty clear that what's happening now is not just natural variation.
Right. And some studies predict that we could see an ice-free Arctic Ocean in the summer as early as 2030.
2030. That's just around the corner.
And it's not just the sea ice that's being affected. The land itself is also changing rapidly.
Yeah, we read about that crazy heat wave in Siberia in 2021 where they hit 118 degrees Fahrenheit.
118 degrees. That's insane. And that heat wave contributed to these massive wildfires that raged across Siberia.
They even had these zombie fires that were burning underground in the peat.
Wow, so the Arctic is literally on fire.
And all this melting ice and thawing permafrost is opening up the Arctic to a whole new set of opportunities and challenges.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it's becoming easier to access natural resources.
Ah, so things like oil and gas exploration.
Exactly. The USGS estimates that there could be huge amounts of undiscovered oil and gas in the Arctic.
And that's not all. There's also a lot of interest in mining for minerals like lithium and rare earth elements.
Right. Those are crucial for all sorts of modern technologies like batteries and smartphones.
So the Arctic is becoming this new frontier for resource extraction.
But that also raises all sorts of geopolitical issues, because as the ice melts, those long-standing international borders become more important.
Right, because now countries can actually access those areas and potentially claim them.
Exactly. And that's leading to some pretty interesting disputes.
Like what?
Well, one example is the Hans Island Whiskey War between Canada and Denmark.
The Whiskey War, what's that?
So there's this tiny little island called Hans Island that's located between Canada and Greenland, which is a part of Denmark.
Okay.
And for decades, both countries have been claiming sovereignty over this island.
But it's just a tiny island. Why is it so important?
Well, it's not really about the island itself. It's
Oh.
more about the principle of the thing, and also about the potential resources in the surrounding waters.
So what did they do? Have like a little war over it?
No, not quite.
Yeah.
But it was pretty funny. They would send their military personnel to the island, and they would leave behind a bottle of their national liquor and a flag.
Really? So the Canadians left whiskey and the Danes left schnapps.
Exactly. It was this weird symbolic battle that went on for years.
Did they ever resolve it?
Yeah, actually they did. In 2022, they agreed to divide the island in half.
So they split it down the middle?
Pretty much. It was a really good example of how, even in a time of global tensions, these kinds of disputes can be resolved peacefully.
That's encouraging, but it also highlights the importance of having clear boundaries and international agreements.
Absolutely. And that's where science comes in.
How so?
Well, scientific research is becoming increasingly important for establishing territorial claims in the Arctic.
I can see that. If you can prove that a certain area of the seabed is geologically connected to your country, then you have stronger claim to it under international law.
Exactly. And that's why things like the airstrip at Resolute Bay are so important.
Resolute Bay, isn't that in Canada?
Yeah, it's often called the gateway to Canada's high Arctic because it's this key transportation hub for scientific research and military operations.
So building that airstrip was a strategic move by Canada.
Absolutely. It was a way to assert their presence in the region and facilitate scientific research that could support their territorial claims.
It's interesting to compare that to the situation in Antarctica, where there's this international treaty that basically sets aside all territorial claims and designates the whole continent as a zone for scientific research.
Right, the Antarctic Treaty is a really unique agreement. But there's nothing like that for the Arctic.
So it's much more of a free-for-all up there.
Pretty much.
Nice.
And that makes things a lot more complicated.
I bet. And all this talk about airstrips and research stations makes me think about those amazing Canadian bush pilots.
Oh, yeah. Those guys are legends. They were instrumental in opening up the Arctic for scientific exploration.
With those big balloon tires on their planes, right?
Exactly. They could land almost anywhere.
Which is pretty essential when you're dealing with the rugged terrain and unpredictable weather of the Arctic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And those pilots played a key role in this massive Canadian geological survey called Operation Franklin that took place in the 1950s.
What was the goal of that?
Well, the main objective was to assess the mineral potential of the Canadian Arctic.
So they were looking for things like gold and diamonds.
Not just those things, they were looking for everything. They wanted to get a comprehensive understanding of the geology of the region.
And those surveys were really important for later scientific discoveries, right?
Absolutely. The maps and data they collected became a roadmap for future research. And it's thanks to those early surveys that we were able to find some really amazing fossils in the Arctic,
Like what?
like Tiktaalik rosé.
What's that?
It's this really important fossil that shows the transition from fish to land-dwelling vertebrates.
Wow. So it's like a missing link in evolutionary history.
Exactly. And it was found in the Canadian Arctic thanks to the groundwork laid by those early geological surveys.
That's incredible. And all of that research eventually led to the establishment of permanent scientific infrastructure in Resolute Bay, right?
Right. It's become a major hub for Arctic research.
Yeah.
And it all started with those early explorations and surveys.
It's amazing how much we've learned about the Arctic over the years, but there's still so much more to discover.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest mysteries is the Lomonosov Ridge.
The Lomonosov Ridge. What's that?
It's this massive underwater mountain range that runs right across the Arctic Ocean.
Wow. How long is it?
It's over 1,800 kilometers long. So it's a really significant feature. And it basically divides the Arctic Ocean into two basins.
So why is it such a big deal?
Well, it's all tied into this UN agreement called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS.
Okay, I've heard of that. It has something to do with countries claiming parts of the ocean, right?
Exactly. UNCLOS basically says that a country can claim the seabed and the resources within a certain distance from its coastline.
But how do they measure that distance? I mean, the ocean floor is not exactly flat.
That's where the continental shelf comes in. It's basically the underwater extension of a continent.
So if a country can prove that a certain part of the seabed is actually part of their continental shelf?
Then they can claim it and all the resources that come with it.
Ah, I see. So the Lomonosov Ridge is important because it could potentially extend the continental shelves of several countries.
Exactly. And that's why there's so much interest in it from Russia, Canada, and Denmark.
Because they all think that part of the ridge is connected to their landmass.
Exactly. And they've all submitted claims to the UN to try and prove it.
So it's like an underwater land grab.
Pretty much. And it's getting pretty heated because there are potentially huge amounts of oil and gas and other resources at stake.
And Russia already made a pretty bold statement back in 2007 when they planted a titanium flag on the seabed at the North Pole.
Right. That was a pretty clear way of saying, we claim this.
But how do you actually prove that a certain part of the seabed is connected to a particular continent?
Well, it involves a lot of scientific research. You have to study the geology of the seabed and compare it to the geology of the surrounding land masses.
So it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle.
Kind of. And there's this one really interesting story about how a team of scientists from Sweden and Denmark use a single boulder to support Denmark's claim to a huge chunk of the Arctic seabed.
A single boulder? How is that possible?
So they were studying this area of the Lomonosov Ridge, and they dredged up this boulder from the seabed.
Oh.
And when they analyzed it, they found that it had this really unusual coating of magnesium oxide.
Magnesium oxide. Why is that important?
Well, it turns out that magnesium oxide forms very slowly in seawater over thousands of years.
So the fact that this boulder had this coating meant that it had been sitting on the seabed undisturbed for a very long time.
Exactly. And that suggests that it was actually part of the Lomonosov Ridge and not just a random rock that had fallen off a ship or something.
So that was one piece of evidence that supported Denmark's claim.
Right. But they also had to look at the internal structure of the boulder and compare it to the geology of Greenland.
And did they find a match?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And that was another piece of evidence that supported their claim.
So basically, they used this one rock to argue that a big chunk of the Arctic seabed is actually an extension of Greenland.
Exactly. It was a really clever piece of detective work.
But I thought you said that Russia, Canada, and Denmark have all submitted claims to the UN.
They have. So now the UN has to review all the evidence and try to decide who has the strongest claim.
And that's not going to be easy.
No, it's going to be a long and complicated process. And it's not just about the Lomonosov Ridge either. There are overlapping claims in other parts of the Arctic as well.
Like where?
Well, there's an area in the Beaufort Sea off the coast of Alaska and Yukon where the U.S. and Canada both claim the continental shelf.
Oh, wow. So even close allies can have disagreements over these things.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole issue of Arctic shipping routes.
Right. As the ice melts, those routes are becoming more navigable.
Exactly. And Canada claims that some of those routes pass through their internal waters.
But other countries argue that they're international straits.
Right. So there's a lot of potential for conflict there.
It's a real mess. And to make things even more complicated, the U.S. isn't even a signatory to UNCLOS.
Right, which means they're not bound by the same rules as everyone else.
So they can basically do whatever they want.
Not exactly. They still have to abide by international norms,
Yeah.
but it definitely gives them more leverage.
And then you have China entering the picture.
Right. China has been calling itself a near-Arctic state, and they're increasingly interested in the region.
What are their interests?
Well, they're looking for access to resources and new shipping routes. And they're also investing heavily in Arctic research.
So it's a really complex geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely. There was this agreement called the Ilulissat Declaration that was signed in 2008 by the 5 Arctic coastal states.
So Canada, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the U.S.
Exactly. And it was an attempt to establish some basic principles for cooperation in the Arctic.
But it didn't really address the issue of territorial claims.
No. And it also left out some key players like Iceland, Sweden, and Finland.
So it was a good first step, but it wasn't enough.
Right. And in recent years, we've seen a real breakdown in Arctic cooperation.
Especially with the war in Ukraine.
Right. Russia has been increasingly isolated from the rest of the Arctic Council.
So it's a pretty tense situation.
Absolutely. And all of this geopolitical maneuvering is happening against the backdrop of climate change, which is having a huge impact on the people who live in the Arctic.
Right. We can't forget about the human cost of all these changes.
Absolutely. The Inuit people have been living in the Arctic for thousands of years, but their way of life is being threatened by the melting ice and the thawing permafrost.
And they've also been mistreated by governments in the past.
Yeah, there's a really sad history of forced relocations of Inuit families in Canada during the 1950s.
What happened?
Well, the Canadian government wanted to assert their sovereignty over the high Arctic, so they basically forced these families to move to these remote and inhospitable areas.
Did they at least give them support to survive in these new places?
Not really. They were promised better hunting grounds and a better life, but it was all a lie.
So they were essentially abandoned.
Pretty much. They were left to fend for themselves in these harsh conditions, and many of them suffered terribly.
That's awful. And what was the justification for doing this?
The government claimed that they were trying to establish a presence in the Arctic to prevent other countries from claiming it.
But they were using these families as pawns?
Exactly. And it was a terrible injustice.
Mm.
The Canadian government eventually apologized for these relocations in 2019.
That's good, but I imagine the damage has already been done.
Absolutely. Those communities are still dealing with the legacy of those forced relocations today.
And it's not just in Canada either. The Yupik people in Alaska are facing similar challenges due to erosion and flooding caused by climate change.
Right. There's this village called Newtok that's literally sinking into the sea.
Wow. And what are they doing about it?
They're trying to relocate the entire village to higher ground, but it's an incredibly expensive and complicated process.
And it's a problem that's going to get worse as sea levels rise.
Absolutely. It's a stark reminder that climate change is already having a very real impact on people's lives.
And it's only going to get worse.
And at the heart of all these changes is permafrost.
Permafrost? Isn't that just frozen ground?
It is. But it's a lot more important than most people realize.
How so?
Well, permafrost is basically like a giant freezer that's been storing organic matter for thousands of years.
Like what kind of organic matter?
Dead plants and animals.
Mostly.
Okay, and what happens when it thaws?
Well, all that organic matter starts to decompose. And when that happens, it releases methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Which are greenhouse gases.
Exactly. So the thawing of permafrost is actually contributing to climate change.
Oh, wow. So it's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And it's not just the greenhouse gases either. The thawing of permafrost is also causing all sorts of problems for infrastructure.
Well, when the ground thaws, it can become unstable and cause buildings and roads to sink or collapse.
Oh, wow. That's a big problem.
Yeah, and it's happening all over the Arctic.
And there's really not much we can do to stop it.
Not really. Once the permafrost starts to thaw, it's very difficult to reverse the process.
So we're just stuck with the consequences.
Pretty much. And those consequences are going to be felt by both humans and animals.
Right. We've already talked about how the Inuit people are being affected, but what about the wildlife?
Well, a lot of Arctic animals depend on the ice and the permafrost for their survival.
Like polar bears.
Exactly. Polar bears need the sea ice to hunt for seals, which are their main food source.
But as the ice melts, they're having to spend more time on land where they're not as efficient hunters.
Right, and that's leading to malnutrition and starvation.
And it's not just polar bears either. Other animals like walruses and seals are also being affected.
Exactly. And some species are being forced to move further north as the climate warms.
Which can bring them into conflict with other species. Exactly. It's a really complex situation. And it's hard to predict exactly how all these changes will play out in the long run.
But one thing's for sure. The Arctic is a place that's undergoing rapid and dramatic change. And those changes are going to have far-reaching consequences for the entire planet.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Arctic, I think it's important to remember that this is not just a story about a far-off land of ice and snow.
Right. This is a story about our planet and our future.
Exactly. The Arctic is a bellwether for the impacts of climate change, and what's happening there is a warning sign for the rest of the world.
And it's a reminder that we need to take action now to address this crisis.
Absolutely. If we don't, future generations will inherit a very different planet than the one we know today.
And I think the story of the Arctic also raises some really interesting questions about the relationship between humans and nature.
Like what?
Well, we've seen how human actions have had a profound impact on the Arctic environment.
Through things like pollution and climate change.
Exactly. And now those changes are coming back to haunt us. Right. The melting ice and the thawing permafrost are creating all sorts of problems for people who live in the Arctic and around the world.
So it's a reminder that we're all connected and that our actions have consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it also raises the question of how we can live more sustainably in the future.
Right. Can we find a way to meet our needs without destroying the planet?
That's the big challenge.
Yeah.
And it's one that we all need to be thinking about.
And the Arctic is a great place to start because it's a place where the stakes are so high and the changes are happening so fast.
So we encourage you to continue learning about the Arctic and to think about what you can do to make a difference.
Because the future of this region and the future of our planet are inextricably linked.
And that's the deep dive for